that, but it's about 100 pages. And if Good morning, everybody, and welcome to week 2 of the course. We are done with poetry and we're moving on to Heart of Darkness. Hopefully by now you have done your first reading of the text. That's hugely important. That was lesson 3 of the previous unit. And if you haven't completed the first reading, then today I am exempting you pretty much from the lesson. It makes no sense to discuss a novel that you haven't read. Absolutely none. So rather than scrambling with online resources and trying your best to put together some lists that you don't actually remember but will pretend that you remember for today's lesson, what I'd much rather have you do is actually just read for the day. Heart of Darkness is a novella. It's about 100 pages long of normal text. It depends on the version that you're using. The version that we're using, the one that I've identified online, has us at more pages than that. But it's about 100 pages. And if you put 5 hours of reading in, you'll be able to tear through a lot of those pages. Today's lesson will be about putting another layer of paint on your understanding. Having done your road mapping, having done your initial read, now we'll go back over the novel and we'll look at its structure and style as a means of just recalling some details and putting together some initial notes, right? Now, the notes themselves are not really what's important. It's the act of note-taking that's important, and I want to get into a little bit of psychology right now, some basic psychology revolving around learning and how the mind actually operates when it comes to learning. I want you to imagine that your mind is a big glass and the teacher or the lesson starts pouring water into that glass. Well, after about 10 minutes, this is what my understanding is, after about 10 minutes, the average attention span ends. Your glass basically fills up. I want you to imagine, just think about a time where you've been in a class and the teacher has spoken for most of the class. Every school's got that teacher who mostly talks. Do you remember there being a class where you recall the first 10 or 15 minutes of what happened and the rest is a blur? Or maybe you remember the last 10 minutes and the first part is a blur, or you remember bits and pieces in between. That's a symptom of the fact that you haven't processed the information. So let's get back to that analogy of the glass. Imagine that every 10 minutes or so, you take a big drink of water and you empty the glass. And then we keep filling it and you keep drinking and we keep filling it. And that way, the glass never starts overflowing and spilling. Processing the information means you have to do something with it, right? And this is very important for bringing information from your short-term memory to your long-term memory, where actual learning, I guess we would say, happens. If you want to classify learning as the long-term retention of information that could then be used for a purpose, all right? As opposed to just trying to cram stuff into the short-term memory in time for an exam. So processing the information, there's lots of ways you can do it. One of them is note-taking. By taking notes, the act of taking notes helps to process that information, to use it. An even better way to process information, though, is through conversation. When it comes to English and social sciences and pretty much any subject, one of the best things that you can do is to talk about the things that you have read with other people who have read the same things. And that's what we're going to be doing in this unit, a lot of discussing, which involves you giving your thoughts and you listening to other people's thoughts and responding to those thoughts in our discussion forums. All right, so we're going to be processing information today, and we're going to be doing it in the form of discussion later on, but the first thing you're going to be doing is making some notes. So what do I want you to take notes about? Well, basically style and structural things. So Heart of Darkness is a frame tale, which means it is a story within a story. We start off with a few people on board a yacht. They're in the Thames River, which is the river that flows through London, and they're waiting for the tide to go out so that they can sail out to sea. We don't know exactly where they're headed to, but they're on a yacht. They're probably just out for a pleasure cruise or something, maybe just enjoying the high life of, after a good career and successful career, just enjoying the benefits of that. And there's a few people on that boat, and one of them is Marlowe, who then narrates the main tale, which is his story of traveling to Africa and specifically meeting Kurtz. Marlowe is the, I guess you'd say, the hero or the protagonist of the story, but one of the weird things about Heart of Darkness, and there's a lot of weird things, it breaks a lot of rules when it comes to structuring a novel. If you were a structuralist, your critique of this novel would be, you might really not like it, but at the same time, you might just be fascinated by the fact that there are so many inconsistencies with the way that a novel should be set up. One of them is the fact that Marlowe isn't a clear protagonist. He's actually kind of a cold, mean guy. He's the kind of guy who you could die at his feet and he will get upset because you bled on his socks. So Marlowe is more of an anti-hero. This is a style choice that Conrad makes. He decides to frame this around an anti-hero instead of a hero. There's also no clear antagonist of the story too, because our protagonist thinks that Kurtz, who is definitely, he fits the bill of an antagonist, he's a horrible, horrible man who puts people's heads on stakes outside of his hut as he goes off in the wilderness and raids tribes for ivory. But our protagonist loves Kurtz on a certain level, or at least he's fascinated by him, and he sticks up for him. Kurtz is certainly a monster, but then again, so is the company itself, and you're going to be learning more about what the Belgian Congo was, and how horrific it was there as far as colonial policy goes. The company is a monster as well, and the company is fighting Kurtz, and Kurtz is fighting the company on like a certain level of conflict, and that leaves you wondering, like, who's the good guy? Because if there's a fight happening and one of the combatants is a bad guy, you would think the person fighting him is a good guy, but it's weird because it's like two monsters fighting each other and the protagonist is rooting for one of those monsters. Marlowe is our narrator of our main tale. So just understand there's two narrators here actually. There's the nameless narrator on this boat who's sitting in the darkness listening to Marlowe go on and on about his story. And every once in a while, Marlowe breaks off from it or he gets interrupted from it. So just be aware that every once in a while, the narration of the main tale breaks off and we end up back in the frame, which is that setting on that boat in London. Now, as a structuralist, you ask yourself, why did Conrad do that? You're interested in his choices. And we would think that there's got to be some reason. So why? Why do you think that Conrad decided to frame this? Why not just tell the story? It would have been pretty simple to just tell it as Marlowe, but he chooses not to, right? Why does he choose to have Marlowe as an anti-hero? Why not have him be a hero who goes in and maybe does some good in this bleak, dark place that is the Congo? Marlowe as a narrator, getting back to style choices, the structure being the fact that we have to have a narration going on and it's first person participant in both cases. But Marlowe is an unreliable narrator. An unreliable narrator is somebody whose credibility as a narrator is under question, and there's a lot of reasons why we should question Marlowe as a narrator, as being somebody who can tell us the real truth. The best, I think, example is the fact that Marlowe says he hates liars, and yet he's a liar, and he lies several times throughout the story. And so that in itself is a pretty good indication that he's not exactly reliable. As far as the rest of the framing goes, we have the traditional plot, characters, and setting. So we've got Kurtz and we've got Marlowe and we've got a supporting cast of characters as well. And I'll have you do some recall there and make a list of different characters you remember. The setting. The frame tale is obviously set on aboard the yacht. The main tale is set in the Belgian Congo, which is a horrible place, and we're going to get into more detail in a subsequent lesson about this. It is the worst place on earth at that time in history, and it is terribly bleak and dark and desolate, and that creates a mood that just you can never shake. The entire mood of this novel is just so bleak, and the setting really reinforces it. But then again, everything about the characters and the plot does as well. So there's so many terrible things that happen here. It's almost like, I don't know, you almost lose track or lose sight of the fact that you are witnessing through the eyes of Marlowe horrible things, like people dying slowly of starvation. But the way that Marlowe narrates it is it's so matter of fact that you almost have to do a double take and say, wait a minute, what is he talking about? There's people who have been like worked to death, a big group of people who have been worked to death and no longer resemble human beings. Like, hold on a second, what did he just say? You're going to have those moments if you read carefully. The plot is kind of consistent, but again, there's an inconsistency that goes on here. So inciting incident, rising action, climax is what we would expect. We have the inciting incident. We have Marlowe arriving in Africa and first hearing about Kurtz, and the rising action is him on his way to see Kurtz, and we see him as he goes farther and farther up the river. The action rises farther and farther along until we reach the climax of the story where he meets Kurtz. But it's not even a real climax. Like, nothing happens, really. There's no big action unless you count, tracking down a guy who's crawling away because he's dying of malaria action. There's no great revelation that happens, as is the case in some novels with the climax of the revelation style. We don't have that either. We have a man wasting away and finally dying. And if you look at Sparks Notes or Shmoop or anything, they'll say that, the horror, that's the climax. But is that really a climax when you think about it? Everything has built up to that. Doesn't that in itself feel like a bit of a letdown? So that gives us a pretty good starting point anyways. I've got more detailed notes up in lesson 1A. So have a look at the notes, and then the activity is going to involve you making a series of lists based on what you remember from your first reading. And this is why anybody who hasn't done an initial reading can't really do lesson 1A. I also don't want anyone really doing lesson 1B unless they've done some reading, because lesson 1B is part of the discussion. And I don't want you contributing unless you have something to contribute. Remember, the poet adds something. The hack adds nothing. I don't want you to be a hack. I want you to do your work and become a poet, figuratively speaking. Lesson 1C, though, is kind of a fun one. There's a movie called Apocalypse Now, which all the history people out there probably heard of and watched. As a child of the 80s and 90s, I grew up on a steady diet of Vietnam War movies. Apocalypse Now is set in the Vietnam War, and it is an adaptation of Heart of Darkness. An adaptation means it's not exactly Heart of Darkness, but Heart of Darkness is more than just the inspiration of this movie. There's a lot of consistency, both as in terms of actual plot and characters, but also just like symbolic or figurative consistency between these two texts. And as somebody who has read the novel and has a basic understanding of it, I'm going to get you to watch some clips of Heart of Darkness and see if you can make some connections. So at the end of today's lesson, you should have a nice new coat of paint on your understanding, having processed a lot of this information, having dug into your memory to recall some details and putting together some notes. Hopefully things will be a bit more clear, and if you have a clear view of Heart of Darkness in time for tomorrow's lesson, you're going to get so much more out of it. Tomorrow we're going to get into the figurative and underlying meaning and look at the first of 3 themes and do some close reading of part 1.